Writer to Writer. I'm your host, Kat Filer, also known as KJ Filer. My guest today is Wayne Turmel, the author of 10 nonfiction books and 5 novels. Most of you probably know him from his Johnny Lycan series, or at least that's what you're emailing me about. But there's way more to him than that. He spent nearly 20 years as a stand-up comedian, touring through Canada, the US, and the Caribbean. Eventually, he says he ran away from the circus and joined the real world. Wayne originally hails from the small town of Mission, British Columbia, Canada. He now lives in Las Vegas, Nevada with his wife, the Duchess, and Mad Max, the defender of the realm and the most manly of poodles. Hi, Wayne. How are you doing?
I am well, Miss Cat. How are you?
Good. Can you tell us about Mad Max right off the bat?
Mad Max. Mad Max is our pandemic baby.
Oh, okay.
Before we moved to Vegas, we had lost the longtime best dog in the world. And so we hadn't replaced him for a while. And then during the pandemic, I decided my wife needed a distraction. Otherwise, I had her undivided attention. And so we started rescuing little dogs in the hopes of finding the right one. And I remember saying, more than a year old, already housebroken, no poodles. And so, of course, here I am with Mad Max, scourge of reptiles everywhere, and he sits in his bed beside my desk most of the day. So
I wondered if he was maybe your writing assistant. Most of us have something, goldfish, cats, dogs, or
exactly
something.
right.
Yeah, I miss my cat terribly. But then again, people don't miss seeing her tail as she comes out in front of the camera.
Indeed.
So,
Max fortunately isn't a lap jumper. So, most people know that he exists, but he doesn't impose himself on meetings like this.
okay, well, that's good to know. So a reader requested you as a fiction author, but let's talk about your other life for a minute. You've written articles and blog posts that have appeared in odd places such as Utah CEO Magazine, the Writer's Digest Online, Huffington Post, and more.
Yeah, when I ran away from the circus, I had to join the real world, and I was lucky. I didn't know it at the time, but I was lucky in that I had like this 18-year hole in my resume where I hadn't had a real job. And, when you start looking for a day job, I had one skill, which is I could stand there and talk. It was the one thing I knew how to do. And so I fell into, quite literally, the presentation skills training arena, which got me my first big boy training job, which got me writing articles, and different people had asked me, and somebody asked me to contribute a chapter to a book, and then they'd asked me to co-write a book. And before I knew it, I was writing books on fascinating topics like 6 weeks to a great webinar and Meet Like You Mean It, and things like that. And the day job, as I got progressively deeper into my career, we actually have a 3-book series, Long Distance Leader, Long Distance Teammate, Long Distance Team, which is a very, very good seller and has positioned me as, when I choose to focus on my day job, position us pretty well. So it's funny, I'm fairly well known in that sphere.
Yeah.
And then there's the stuff I like to do, the stuff that feeds my soul, which is, the likes of this.
Yeah, we all have that deep, dark secret of what actually pays the bills. I'm still doing publicity for authors, even though
Sure.
it's not where my passion is. It is definitely where all my friends are, so it's still fun. But
yeah.
it's
One of the misconceptions that people have, they always say writing is a lonely business. Actually, typing is lonely. Writing is incredibly social.
Yes. Not only are you in the company of other people a lot, but also your characters are keeping you company. So, and that's a little bit of information for aspiring writers, but also readers. These people that we write, they're real. They're actually in our heads. So yeah, I talk to mine. I don't know about you. So.
No, mine largely ignore me.
Oh no.
Because I keep trying to get them to do things that they don't want to do. But I am very, very connected. Part of that, I think, is because all of my novels are written at least partially in first person.
Yeah. Yeah.
so that and they're all different characters except for the Johnny Lycan book, but I write in first person. It's a very method actor, which sounds incredibly arty and ridiculous, but way of getting into the character. But the problem is that you become the character, right? You have to think like that person all the time.
Yeah.
And so I get very attached.
Yeah. Yeah. My husband told me that I talk to myself, and I don't talk to myself. I talk to these people that live in my head, and I actually have conversations with them. And so, yeah,
My
sometimes,
wife calls them my invisible friends.
yeah, they're like that. I like that.
And she doesn't differentiate between the characters in my book and my friends and readers on the internet that I interact with but have never met. They're just
Well,
all my invisible friends.
I like her.
I do
So
too,
then,
actually.
yeah, a little bit. Okay, so then you began writing fiction. I think you started with the publication The Count of Sahara, which is
Yeah,
historical fiction.
which is now, God help me, 9 years ago. I can't even believe that. Um, I was, rounding 50, and my daughter, who had just turned like 22 or something, was like, "Oh, I'm so old and I don't know what I'm going to do. And I just dropped out of school." And I gave her the "You're never too old"
Yeah.
speech. But even though I had written stand-up and written movie scripts and magazine articles and nonfiction books, I had this thing in the back of my skull that said I would never be a real writer until I did a novel.
Okay.
And so, I couldn't afford either a Corvette or a divorce. So this became my midlife crisis.
Okay.
And I was very excited. Byron de Prorock is a character that I've been obsessed with for years, a real life historical character. Um, so I did Count of the Sahara, and it was very well received. And then I did Akra's Bastard, which is kind of a Crusades take on Kipling's Kim.
Yeah.
It's about a young orphan during the Crusades who gets recruited as a spy. And there are two books in that series. My daughter is responsible for that because I wrote the first book as a standalone.
Yeah.
And I had this lovely epilogue about what happened to Luca and what the rest of his life was like. And my daughter informed me that if I put that in there and didn't write another story, that when I got old enough, she would put me in a home and ignore me,
Well, there you go.
which is a threat not to be taken lightly.
No.
So there was the second book, Akra's Orphans, and then I did a complete 180 and started the Johnny Lycan series. For good
Yeah.
or evil, here we are.
Yeah. And I started with Johnny Lycan, but I have just started the series that you're talking about now, so I don't know a whole lot. But I know I looked at the blurb and said, oh, this is definitely something that needs to be to be read. So
It should be in everybody's TBR pile.
Yeah, it's a very different take on. Well, I mean, the story is something that you might have read before, but not that kind of character and not that take. I was really taken in by the description. So yeah, I'll be reading that. So how many books do you have in total?
I want to say, and it depends how you count them, which I know sounds weird, but I've done like little books for my employer and stuff like that. I think I am at 17 total with the new Johnny
Wow.
Lycan, which comes out in May. So
Okay.
six novels, and then whatever the math adds up to in the nonfiction space.
Yeah. So at least one listener who nominated you for the interview wants to know all about Johnny Lake and how he came to be. Please do tell.
Okay. Oh boy. So first of all, you got to realize that werewolves are my horror jam.
Okay.
This goes back as a young man. I remember distinctly babysitting my cousin, and the TV station out of Seattle used to do, Friday night monster movie kind of things. And I saw The Curse of the Werewolf with Oliver. I'm blanking.
Yeah, I can't
It'll
fill it in,
it'll
but I
come to
can
me.
see it. Yeah.
Oliver Reed.
Yeah.
Uh, And it just resonated with me because I think every 13-year-old boy feels like he's got this raging hair monster inside of him.
Yeah.
Particularly if you happen to be an intentionally very well-behaved, nice young man, which I was raised to be. So that thing about having something inside of us that we can't quite control has always driven this. And then years later, I read something by Robert McCammon, a wonderful little trashy novel called The Wolf's Hour. And the way I would describe it is, okay, he's a secret agent. All right, he's a secret agent in World War II fighting Nazis. Okay, he's a Russian secret agent in World War II fighting Nazis. And oh, by the way, he's a werewolf. Like, where do I sign up for that, right? So that has always fascinated me. And then when I started thinking about, I've always loved urban fantasy. I'd like to take a kick at it. What would the character be? And I literally had a dream about this Russian gangster fighting a werewolf. And that was the beginning. And I'm a big believer in lucid dreaming. I actually solve a lot of plot problems that way. But it's funny because the very genesis of Johnny Lycan came from that dream. And the kind of main secondary character in the final book, The Last Witchfinder, which is out May 2nd, also came to me in this kind of dream thing. So I know how artsy and weird that sounds, but my brain is going to do what it's going to do,
No, I think readers even think that way. You have expectations of the characters, and that's in essence joining the writer on the journey. So yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing about Johnny is after writing historical fiction, I was so thrilled to be able to write something. We lived almost 20 years in Chicago. I love that town. This book feels Johnny Lycan in the Anubis Disc and the third book, The Last Witchfinder, very much feel like Chicago. There are a lot of references in there that only, not that anybody couldn't get, but if you've been there, you can feel it, right? It's very Chicago. The challenge, because I write in first person, is making him sound like a 30-year-old ne'er-do-well rather than, me. And I realized I need to quit using my voice and just imagine every lunkhead my daughter has dated over the last couple of years.
That's hilarious. Oh, God.
And by golly, there he is.
That is hilarious. And for anybody who has not discovered this book, this is urban fiction. Yes,
it's urban fantasy. I call it urban fantasy noir.
Urban fantasy,
kind of the closest thing, if you're doing comps, and of course your publisher wants you to do comps, is like Dresden Files.
Oh, yes. Oh, I can see that. Yeah.
Which is set in Chicago. I mean, Dresden is a wizard and he has a different kind of magic system and such, but it's the same idea. I mean, the thing about Johnny, Dresden, most urban fantasy people know that there's all this stuff out there.
Yeah.
And poor Johnny, because he was adopted from Romania, doesn't know much about himself, and he's kind of learned to be a werewolf self-taught. And at the beginning of the book, he thinks he's the weirdest thing out there.
Okay. Yeah, but he's fighting something even weirder.
Well, as it turns out, right? He didn't expect that when he got into this. And that's the idea, is that as the books progress, the realization that there's something going on in the universe that Johnny may not know about and is going to have to deal with is part of his arc, his adulting, his turning into a real grown-up boy.
No, I'm really glad that it's a series because I get the impression that you could really start anywhere. You wouldn't have to start with book one. And I really like that it's a series because pretty quickly you fall in love with the characters, and when you shut the book or you're on the last page, the first thing that goes through your mind is there any more? Where can I get more?
Oh, so, God bless you. I mean, that was the intent, right? With this book, it was always intended to be a series, first of all, as opposed to the Luca Lapou stories, which were accidentally 2 books, right? This one was always intended to be a series. It was always Johnny's kind of starting from, I think I can be a grown-up if I do this detective thing, to where he winds up at the end of the third book, where he's a little more adult, a little bit. And the characters from the first book, I really enjoy the characters.
Yeah.
I know every writer says that, but I think I really captured Chicago. They're a diverse set of characters without being patronizing about it. And it's funny because I have a reader in Europe who happens to be gay, who has a huge crush on Bill,
Okay.
Johnny's best friend.
Yeah. No, I
Matter of
can
fact,
see that.
he actually sent me an email and said, if Bill ever comes to Belgium, let me know.
Yeah.
Nurse Ball is a
Yeah.
wonderful character that I have a lot of fun with. And in the second book, and lots of people like Nurse Ball, in the second book, there's a character named Cree who Johnny has a bit of a fling with. And the number of people who have told me they have a girl crush on Cree is really, really kind of flattering and quite lovely. So the secondary characters, and then a lot of the characters, thread through the book. But I'm very proud of the secondary characters, and I think they're a lot of fun.
I think you should be proud of them. I forgot that you were a guy when I was reading some of these characters, Nurse Paul being one of them. So yeah, you did that very well.
She's great. I love, first of all, I've always had a thing for older women. When I was young, it was my kryptonite. But I always liked the idea of, I hated the idea of the woman in a detective story just kind of having no agency and always being in distress.
Yeah.
And Nurse Ball is every bit as badass as Johnny is. And by the third book, you find all about her backstory. And
yeah, she is definitely not somebody you would want to meet in a dark alley and then piss off. So yeah, for sure.
although, she does wear cool stuff under her nursing
She does.
uniform.
Oh yeah.
So she is a bad girl as
Oh
well as
yeah.
being a badass. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. She is the perfect mix of sexy and badass. So yeah, I like
And
her.
she takes young Johnny on a bit of a journey, which is fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So was this supposed to be a trilogy from the start?
It was always going to be a series.
Okay.
My literary ADD basically said, as I was halfway through the second one, I had story ideas that could have gone on further. And I went, no, you know what? I need to do the third one. And I've got literally pages of things I want to write before I die. And the clock is ticking, as it turns out. So I wanted to finish this arc. I wanted this arc to complete. There is room, if and when Johnny returns, there's a logical place for him to pick up. There are still things that he needs to discover about himself. And there's a character in the third book, a young Korean American reporter who I think would be a great idea for his own series.
Okay. Yeah.
So Casper may or may not get a book of his own. And my daughter is insisting that I give Cree her own story and like that.
Sounds like your daughter's your agent. She's great.
She is a piece of work. But it's funny, she gave me feedback on the last book just a couple of weeks ago. And I was surprised. It was very lucid and she had very strong opinions about what worked and what didn't. And, and I'm like, dang, she's 30 now and reads like crazy. So she should have opinions.
Yeah, and she's kind of your audience. I mean, well, I don't know. Your audience is also younger too. So, well, I don't know.
Well,
your
statistically,
audience is pretty
if I'm
broad.
writing for older, I'm fighting the market.
Okay, well, there might be some material that limits the lower age, but the stories are pretty appealing across a broad range.
No, it's designed. Urban fantasy is a young to lower middle age kind of demographic.
Yeah.
I'm always amazed at who reads my books. Like even going back to my historical fiction, my readers have predominantly been female.
Yeah, what's up with that? Mine too. They're supposed to be young adults and it's housewives. It's middle-aged women that are reading my books and I don't understand. I don't know.
Yeah, the only thing is, and you said something earlier that warmed the cockles of my heart. And if you don't know where the cockles are, they're a little to the left of the ventricle.
Okay.
Um, that, you forgot that I think I write female characters pretty well
You
for an
do.
old cishet white guy. And the conversation as well, I've always had an ear for dialogue. I think it goes back to my
Oh yeah.
stand-up roots. And so I think that's why people do it. Like if you say it's a detective story about a werewolf, people are going to go, "Oh, I'm out." But once you kind of get to know the character, and my hope is that, Johnny Lycan will be the gateway drug to my other work.
The one
Because
reader who wrote to me said that what he liked the most about the Johnny Lycan series, and he's apparently on to others, one or the both of the others,
Mhm.
and he said what one of the things he liked was right out the gate. Johnny Lycan is just so weird, but the circumstances are even weirder. So
I,
whenever
I'll
you
take
think
that.
you've got a handle on that, don't think you do because you it's just hang on. There's more coming.
Well,
So
but
yeah,
that's also part of the fun of doing it first person, is that nothing happens that Johnny doesn't see.
yeah,
So when Johnny gets surprised, the reader is learning it for the first time as well.
yeah, yeah. So how do you
Which,
keep from getting stuck in that character's head though?
oh, I have so many voices in my head, and
Yeah.
they all demand time from me. Uh, I don't know that I get stuck. Um, Actually, the problem is I do a deep dive. It's like with Luca in the Luca Lapu stories. I By the time I finished the second book, Luca had like stopped talking to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And I think it's the same thing with Johnny. Like by the time we get to the end of The Last Witch Finder, I think Johnny needs a break from me as much as I need one from
Okay.
him. First of all, I keep putting him through worse and worse stuff. So it's like
Yeah.
he's just kind of saying no mas
Keep
for the moment.
upping the ante for the poor man. Yeah. So yeah. And your characters are very eclectic and they're very diverse. So was that the plan from the beginning, or how did you know you got them right? I mean, like, how did that work out?
You know, I am aware that when people see that I am an old white guy, they tend to have certain assumptions about how my brain works. And that tends not to necessarily be correct. But living in Vancouver, living in Toronto, living in Chicago, LA, through my entire life, the world is full of interesting people and
Yeah.
they don't all look alike. And, Johnny's best friend is a gay man with a physical handicap.
Yeah.
And that actually fits into the story because the reason he's Johnny's best friend is they knew each other in high school, but Johnny saved him from a gay bashing. And so Bill is the only person who has ever seen Johnny turn into Shaggy and live.
Yeah.
And there's a bond there,
Yeah.
right? And then Bill's grandmother is an old Roma woman. And I thought, well, coming from a culture that understands the occult and believes in it and has all these little weapons against it, and being a dirty old lady, she'd be hysterical.
She is. And I love when she disciplines people. It's
Oh, she has
hilarious.
no problem whacking you upside the head.
No.
Bill and Johnny, as young men, both took the occasional wooden spoon across the behind for misbehaving. And then, as I looked for the Cree character, and then, if you live in Chicago, the world is full of trans people and black people and Hispanic people and men and women, and I like that. That's what I like
Yeah.
about living in cities.
Yeah. If there's anything that I miss about Miami, it's that. And people are international. They come from everywhere.
Yeah,
I,
and the thing is, Johnny, as a 30-year-old guy, 30-year-olds live in a very different world than we grew up in.
yeah,
He says, making assumptions about your age and background. Um, but you could have reached a fairly ripe old age and not met somebody who was out gay. You could have not met somebody from a certain country or met a trans person or whatever it is. That's not the case. I mean, my wife, who's a little bit older than I am, see previous statement about patterns you can't break. When she was growing up in Miami, it was still legalized segregation. I mean, it
yeah,
was water fountains were different colors. My daughter went to school in the suburbs of Chicago where 25% of kids were of mixed race of some mix.
yeah, yeah,
So the world is very different. The world isn't just, the people in your immediate circle. And I think as a writer, you have a right, you have a duty to kind of bring the rest of the world in. I don't
yeah,
want just me reading this. Uh, but I think it's also broadens the people who will read you.
yeah. I agree.
You know,
It, yeah. You are rumored to have said history is destined to repeat itself. How did that go?
um, yeah. How did that go? Um, you know, those who know history, uh, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Those who do know history are doomed to stand by and go, "Told you."
Yeah,
And that's how I feel about history. That's why I think I'm going to go back to some historical period. I've got a Foreign Legion story that's burning a hole in my brain. I've got some other things. Uh, but there are just so many great stories out there and great characters. Um,
yeah.
and
So,
so history fascinates me.
so this is, at least for now, the end of the Johnny Lycan series, and you're working on what next?
What I'm working on now is kind of weird. I got burned out at the end of this, and I met an old friend of mine who happens to be a film producer now, and he told me how much he enjoyed Johnny Lycan, and I went, well, if there was a script, would you want to look at it? And so, as it turns out, I have two movie scripts that I'm schlepping. One is basically Johnny Lycan in the Anubis disc. If
Oh
anybody knows
my.
a producer who would care,
Oh
script's
gee.
ready. And
Yes.
the other one is a low budget horror film that I'm real excited about uh, that I'm schlepping. So at the moment, I'm kind of taking a break and doing that.
So yeah. Well, whatever it is, it's going to be very interesting. I'm absolutely blown away by the range of writing. And where can they find your short stories?
Short story. I love short stories, although I am leading the league in magazines accepting my stories, publishing them, and then going out of business. It,
Okay.
it, it is a disturbing pattern, which has not failed to catch my attention. But if they go to my website, wayneturmel.com, I actually have a segment called Short Stories and Other Pieces. And gosh, there's over a dozen stories now that have appeared in various publications around the world um, that I either link to them if they still exist or just have the story there on my site.
Yeah. I like short stories. Sometimes you're someplace and you like an author and you want to read something, but you don't have a lot of time. You have to be sitting in a waiting room or something like that. And so it's always nice to have something like that.
Yeah, I enjoy short stories too. And what I love about it is it gives me a chance it does two things. One is it gives me a chance to let my ADD go and, tell a story that I wouldn't ordinarily tell that
Yeah.
doesn't require a whole novel.
Yeah.
And then sometimes I use them as writing exercises. I've probably got, I think it's half a dozen stories centered around the world of boxing.
Oh gosh. Okay.
That is a passion of mine. I'm a big boxing fan, but it started as trying to learn to write action sequences. And boxing actually is perfect because the rounds are 3 minutes, right? There's
Yeah.
a defined amount of time. Something has to happen in that round that leads to the next round. as a writing exercise, as a way of getting really concise, learning to describe action, filling a short period of time with a lot of stuff, it was a wonderful exercise.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's a great idea. And it's a different type of writing too, like you said.
well, it stretches muscles.
It does.
You know, I've got a couple of stories that are kind of pseudo romantic. They're not romance, but you know, and then there's a couple of horror stories, two of which, by the way, I would call them supernatural, not horror, but two of them actually served as a basis for Johnny Lycan. I
Okay.
used to write for a website in the UK called Storgy, and one of the first things I wrote was a story called The Forger of Cairo, who in that story forges what becomes the Anubis disc.
Oh, okay. Oh
And
my
then I
gosh.
also wrote one called The Clairtangentist, which is about a pawnbroker in Las Vegas. And in the second book, Johnny Lycan and the Vegas Berserker, Johnny goes to Vegas on a case. And so, of course, he's going to run into Lem.
Okay. Okay.
So it's kind of fun. Neither of those stories were written with an eye to that, and yet they were a good jumping off place.
Yeah, and I think that especially when you end a series, if readers can find something like it or maybe about
Yeah.
one of the characters in there, then they still get to visit them because once you that's one of the reasons I reread books is because some of my
Right.
best friends live in there, and the only way to visit them is to read the book.
Yeah, I think Cree deserves her own story. She hasn't
Oh
got one
yes,
yet, but Cree definitely deserves her own story.
yeah,
Um, yeah.
I agree. I totally agree. Well, Wayne, is there a question I haven't asked that you wish that I had?
I don't think so. I mean, it's been all about me. What's not to love?
Well, that's what it's about.
But
So
no,
yeah,
I think that my hope is that okay, the Venn diagram of my audience is very weird, right?
yes.
If you take the people who care about how to do a good web meeting and lead a remote project team, and then you do the people who care about 1920s explorers and little boys in the Crusades and werewolf detectives, you wind up with a Venn diagram that's about that big, which is a very small group of humans, right?
Gee, I
My
wonder.
hope is that people who come across Johnny and enjoy it, they enjoy the humor, they enjoy the storytelling, will kind of work backwards. It's kind of like how I found BB King by listening to the Rolling Stones, right? I kind of hope that people will go, oh, this guy's really good. Oh, I've read his 3 books. What else you got?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
And
that's the
that's
way
what
I
I really
approached it.
hope.
I approached it by meeting you first, and then going to read the book, and then from there I'm expanding out. And I was really surprised to find all of the nonfiction books. And my husband isn't typically a fiction reader. There are exceptions, and yours might be one of them. He's looking at it, but all of the rest of it is stuff that he's interested in reading. So yeah,
Yeah.
people will discover you all different ways. So
And
yeah.
that's the hope, you know. I just hope that people, wherever my brain takes me next, that y'all come with me.
Yeah, for sure. Well, readers, as always, I will post the links below so you can find Wayne, his books, stay up to date on his passion projects, and maybe catch him at a signing or at an event. Also, if you like a book, Wayne's or anybody's book, please don't forget to leave a review or at least some stars. It doesn't have to be much. It's the book version of like and subscribe. And in case you didn't know, you can follow your authors, your favorite authors on Amazon. So just like your favorite YouTube channels, you'll get a notification when there's something new to view. Wayne, I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's been so lovely talking to you, and thank you for the opportunity to meet your readers.
You too. Thanks.